Well, Shana Tova and Gemar Chatima Tova, friends. Thank you for choosing to share Yom Kippur with our sweet corner of Kedusha. I like to call Ner Tamid a little holy corner here in the Sunset District of San Francisco. My face in the mirror's not wrinkled or drawn. My house isn't dirty. The dust is all gone. My garden looks lovely, and so does my lawn. I think that I won't put my glasses back on. I love that little poem. No one knows who wrote it, despite my best efforts, and there are many variations. But I love the honest way it acknowledges that for most people, life is probably pretty messy and far from perfect. And it's nice when every once in a while the harsh glare of reality can be just a little softened, just a little blurred. Yom Kippur gets a bad rap. I wanted especially to include some really upbeat melodies today because actually, traditionally, Yom Kippur is supposed to be a day of celebration. It's only one day, the only full fast day that's mentioned in the Torah. We only have two. The rabbis added Tisha B'Av to commemorate the destruction of the temple. But as I like to say, Jews would much prefer to feast rather than to fast. But once in a while, one day a year, it's a day, we're not supposed to eat or drink anything. But it isn't a day to feel bad about ourselves. It's a day to remember how very, very human we are and how it's actually perfectly okay to be imperfect. Yom Kippur should not be a day about guilt. Instead, it should be a day of grace. And grace is actually a fundamental Jewish concept. It's the love that pours down from the heavens for each and every one of us. It's the love that gave each of us life. And there's been a lot of talk this year, suddenly all over the place, about, in a way, rebranding Yom Kippur. The notion of teshuvah, which so often gets translated as repentance, but of course more accurately means to return, can mean not becoming someone else, but instead returning to who each of us really is. So much of life is about performance. The lovely piece by essayist David Brennan, he writes that so often he thought of Yom Kippur as a day about proving ourselves, editing ourselves, presenting the best version of ourselves, when in fact, this safe space gets to be the opposite. You've often heard it said that perfection is the enemy of the good. And we've had far too much talk in this country about enemies lately. But this expression, the enemy of the good, means, as you all know, that the pain of striving for something that is unattainable, for perfection, can so often stand in the way of us even getting out of the gate to try for something that is good and necessary, even though it will likely be imperfect. There is so little right now that it feels we can agree upon. The divisiveness and the shameful rhetoric in this country is something for which I think we all need to add an al-chet on behalf of this nation. But I think that one thing, unfortunately, we may all be able to agree upon is that the state of the world and our poor country and the situation in Israel and Gaza and for Jews pretty much everywhere is pretty far from perfect right now. And I will admit in front of all of you and the Holy One that I tried to think of some way to give the perfect sermon that would fix even a piece of this. And I have to follow my own advice and let go of thinking that that's remotely possible. So I'll just say that now. This little sermon is far from perfect. And that will just have to be good enough. Perfectionism, however, is a real problem in our society. It's making a lot of people sick. Dr. Gordon Flett, who is a psychology professor who spent his career studying perfectionism, says that especially young people, Gen Zers in particular, are facing an epidemic of perfectionism. Among Canadian high school students, 54% identified with the statement, "I need to be perfect." In 2024, it was about a third of United States teenagers who felt pressure to be perfect. Dr. Flett suspects, and I imagine that you all do too, that the crisis is at least partly fueled by social media. Not just young people are tortured by the gap between their actual and their perfected lives, not to mention the perfected versions of other people's lives that circulate online. He's been doing this research for many years and said, wow, the need to seem perfect seems much bigger now than when we started this research. Dr. Flett and his partners have identified 3 types of perfectionism. I imagine that most of you fall into one of these categories. I know I certainly do. The 3 types are self-oriented perfectionism, requiring perfection of oneself; other-oriented perfectionism, which is railing against the imperfections of everyone else; and socially prescribed perfectionism, believing that others require you to be perfect. In 1923, Sigmund Freud's essay, The Ego and the Id, introduced the concept of the superego, an inner voice whose demands for perfection the ego labors endlessly to fulfill. In the centuries since Freud articulated this model, psychoanalysts have described in a variety of ways the experience of perfectionism and the forces driving it. Alfred Adler, with whom you may also be familiar, a one-time participant in Freud's famous Wednesday night gatherings, is most known today for his notion of the inferiority complex, something that's so common in our parlance, it's hard to imagine it ever wasn't. And that's the idea that human nature is shaped by the desire to overcome personal deficiencies. In 1960, D.W. Winnicott put forward the theory that most people will develop what they call, in capital F and capital S, a false self that hides and protects our more essential self by complying with the expectations of others. And in the 70s and 80s, Hilde Bruch drew upon her work with patients who suffered from anorexia in framing perfectionism as a response to a deep-seated sense of inadequacy. All her efforts, the efforts of the patient with anorexia, her striving for perfection and excessive thinness, are directed toward hiding the fatal flaw of her sense of fundamental inadequacy. I've been reading a lot of pieces lately where I read a quote from one scholar or expert, and suddenly I find them in everything else I'm reading. I know it's an old phenomenon, but I've really been having it a lot lately. I recently met the critic and psychoanalyst Adam Phillips, who wrote that the superego, Freud's superego, with its relentless demand for perfection, is, and I quote, a boring and vicious soliloquist with an audience of one. So why do we keep listening The soliloquist promises to know us in a way that no one else, including ourselves, can ever do. And any avid self-deprecator, any in the room, I won't make you raise your hands, but any avid self-deprecator immediately understands that. If we believe that the worst version of ourselves is the true one, we're protected from being ambushed by our own inadequacy. For those who participated in our Elul series, we read this wonderful little book, Meditations for Mortals by Oliver Burkeman. And sure enough, on day 16, it's a month of meditations and experiences of working on knowing that we will not be here forever and doing what we can with our precious time to make it count. Sure enough, on day 16, who was here but Adam Phillips, describing this inner voice, this false self, which tells us that we are so far from perfect that we may not even take the time to try. And he says, were we to meet this figure socially, this accusatory character, this internal critic, this unrelenting fault finder, we would think there was something wrong with him. He would just be cruel. We might think that something terrible had happened to him, that he was living in the aftermath, the fallout of some catastrophe. And Adam Phillips says, we would be right. The catastrophe is that somewhere along the line, almost all of us will have decided that we just don't make the grade. But what extraordinary finding for me to learn that in all of these studies, in all of these books, some of them with names like Brené Brown's famous The Gifts of Imperfection, in every single one of these, I was amazed that they're not Jewish books, and yet they're so fundamentally Jewish. They have such a wonderful sense of what our tradition has been teaching for thousands of years, that no one is perfect. We have all made mistakes. And on Yom Kippur especially, it's a day to feel okay about those imperfections, to come with all of our messiness, with all of our fears, all of our flaws, all of our wrinkles, and all of our errors, and say, I am okay. I am here. I matter. For the past decade, Dr. Flett has been devoting much of his attention to what he calls the psychology of mattering. And I'm not going to read to you the conclusions of all of these studies. We literally would be here all day. But I love what he says about mattering. That at the end of the day, everyone wants to know that they are important to someone else. He wrote, mattering grants everyone dignity, even as it brings with it a certain humility. Musar students will recognize much of this language, though it comes from the New Yorker in a piece by Leslie Jameson. In the course of a day, we all pivot between contexts in which we matter quite a lot, feeding and caring for others, and ones in which we hardly matter at all, when we're just another commuter on a crowded subway car or on the freeway. This can produce a sense of whiplash, but we might think of that feeling as an invitation to find ourselves right-sized. It can be a reprieve from the illusion that perfection was ever necessary or possible, and a reminder that we all matter, and also sometimes we don't, and that both feelings are true and worth remembering. Yom Kippur is an invitation to shed the elusive goal of perfection. Nothing I say, nothing we say, nothing that's in the Machzor will perfect the world as we know it. But we are invited to do a little bit of a tikkun, just a little repair, a stitch in the tattered shroud of humanity. And with each shred, with each thread, with each little piece of the puzzle that we put in place, we are contributing to making ourselves and the world a better place. And that is about as perfect as it can be. Shana Tova.